The observation deck of the United Galactic Council Station hung in darkness above the colony world of Kepler 7. The massive structure rotated slowly, its sensor arrays sweeping across the planet below like the eyes of a predator. Ambassador Torvin of the Crystalline Collective pressed his geometric form against the transparent aluminum viewport. His body refracted light into sharp patterns that cut through the darkness. Beside him floated Keeper Zex, a being of thick gel and shifting colors. Zex was worried. His chromatophores betrayed his anxiety with waves of deep purple and angry red. The humans requested we observe their offspring, Keeper Zex said. His voice was like wind cutting through a canyon, sharp and impossible to ignore. They claim we need to understand their true nature. They believe we have misjudged them. Ambassador Torvin made a sound that passed for laughter among his crystalline kind. It was a chiming noise, hard and cold. Understand? The humans cannot understand themselves. This child appears even more fragile than the rest of their kind. I have seen the medical readings. The being is vulnerable to temperature changes. It requires regular food and water. Its bones are brittle. Its organs are delicate. What is there to understand except weakness? The quarantine chamber lay 4 levels below them. The humans had insisted the observation happen here, on neutral council territory. The child sat on a standard bunk, reading from a physical book. Luke Morrison was 9 years old. His body was thin. His skin was pale. His frame looked like it could break if someone pushed too hard. Everything about him screamed vulnerability. The humans had sent their best and brightest to the council station weeks earlier. They had argued that Earth deserved a place in the Galactic Alliance. The council had listened with patience that bordered on contempt. Humanity was young as spacefaring species went. Humans had only achieved interstellar travel 40 years ago. They had barely reached beyond their own solar system. They were children playing with tools they did not fully understand, but the humans had been persistent. They had shown data. They had made arguments. They had refused to accept the council's first rejection. And finally, the council had agreed to observe 1 human child in controlled conditions. Perhaps this would show whether the species had value beyond their novelty. Claire Morrison, Luke's mother, had held her son for nearly an hour before the transport took him to the station. She had gripped him so tightly his ribs ached. She had made him promise 3 times that he would call for help if anything went wrong. She had cried while trying to hide the tears. Luke had promised everything his mother asked for, though he did not fully understand why she was so afraid. His father, Jack Morrison, worked for the Earth Defense Institute. Jack designed defensive systems. Jack taught his son how to think about problems systematically. Jack told Luke that understanding your environment meant understanding your survival. Before Luke boarded the transport, his father had spent 2 hours walking him through the station's layout. Jack had shown his son where the exits were. Jack had explained how emergency systems worked. Jack had told his son that knowledge was power, and power kept you alive. Luke had studied the quarantine chamber carefully in the first hours of his isolation. He had found the sensor arrays hidden in the corners. He had discovered the communication panels. He had located the emergency overrides. Nothing was truly secret if you looked carefully enough. A child with a curious mind could learn almost anything if he paid attention. Now, in the observation deck, Ambassador Torvin watched the child turn a page of his book. The being showed no sign of distress, no sign of fear. Luke Morrison simply sat and read as if the fate of an entire species did not rest on his actions. "What is it reading?" Keeper Zex asked. Torvin increased the magnification. The book was titled The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. The cover showed a young human boy on a riverboat. The image made no sense to Torvin. What kind of species produced literature about children and boats? Primitive fiction. Torvin concluded. The humans create stories to distract themselves from the reality of their irrelevance. This child is no exception. He sits and dreams instead of understanding the gravity of his situation. Keeper Zex's colors shifted to a lighter shade. This was his form of doubt. The humans seemed confident. They seemed to believe this observation would demonstrate something important about their kind. Humans believe many things, Torvin said coldly. They believe they deserve a place in the galactic community. They believe their potential justifies their current weakness. They believe that determination and will can overcome the fundamental disadvantages of their species. They are delusional creatures, Keeper Zex. This observation will confirm what we already know. The humans are soft. They are breakable. They are helpless, and they should accept the protection of the Council while surrendering any illusions of independence. The Council chamber buzzed with conversation. Various species exchanged their own observations. The Narratians, beings of collective consciousness, argued that humans showed promise in mathematics. The Zelexians, apex predators who dominated 3 sectors of space, dismissed humanity as prey species with delusions of grandeur. The Council's primary speaker, an ancient being named Carandos, who had served for 3,000 rotations, called for patience. There was no rush in making a final decision about Earth. But beneath the diplomatic language, the Council had already made its judgment. Humanity was too weak to be trusted with real power, too primitive to be given access to advanced technology, too unpredictable to be anything but a controlled vassal state. In the quarantine chamber, Luke Morrison closed his book and lay on his bunk. He stared at the ceiling. He thought about his mother's tears. He thought about his father's careful instructions. He thought about the sensors hidden in the corners. He understood, at 9 years old, that he was being tested. He understood that his performance in this chamber would affect not just his own future, but the future of his entire species. The weight of this knowledge sat on his chest like a physical thing. Luke closed his eyes and thought about what his father had taught him. Problem solving, attention to detail, understanding your environment, knowing your resources, never giving up, even when the odds seemed impossible. He had no idea that his true test was coming. He had no idea that in 72 hours, everything would change. The peaceful observation would become a battle for his survival. The helpless child would become something far more dangerous. But deep in his bones, Luke Morrison felt it coming. He felt the weight of destiny. He felt the power of his own refusal to accept defeat. And in the observation deck above, Keeper Zex watched the human child sleeping and wondered if they had all misjudged what fragility truly meant. Perhaps being soft did not mean being weak. Perhaps breaking easily and reforming was a form of strength that the Council had never understood. Torvin saw Keeper Zex's colors shifting again. "What is troubling you now?" The crystalline being demanded. Keeper Zex took a long moment to answer. "I am wondering if we have made a mistake. I am wondering if the humans understand something we do not." Ambassador Torvin returned his attention to the viewport. "Then we will soon find out," he said coldly. The observation continues. The station's warning systems began their screaming at 14:23 in the observation sector. The alarms cut through the silence like daggers. Every species on the station heard the same message transmitted across all communication. CHNNELs, unauthorized vessel docking. Breach in progress. All personnel to defensive stations. The Council's security forces move fast. They had trained for this scenario 100 times. The docking bay doors sealed. The security teams activated their weapons. The station shifted into combat mode. But something was wrong. The timing was too perfect. The attackers knew exactly when the diplomatic wing would have minimum security. They knew the Council's patrol patterns. They knew where the valuable members of the delegation would be located. The docking bay doors blew open. The Nocturnians poured through like a tide of darkness. They were apex predators, creatures that had evolved in the shadow worlds of the galactic rim. Their bodies were lean and muscular, covered in dark plates that absorbed light. Their eyes glowed with bioluminescent hunger. They had been at war with the Galactic Council for generations. And now they had found their moment. Commander Kelts led the assault team through the station's corridors. He was larger than the others, his body scarred from 100 battles. His eyes glowed brighter than the rest, burning with the fury of a predator finally unleashed. The Nocturnians had studied the station's layout. They had infiltrated the Council's computer systems weeks in advance. They knew exactly where to go. The security forces tried to stop them. Plasma fire lit the corridors in blinding white light. But the Nocturnians were faster. They were stronger. They were warriors who had spent their entire existence fighting. The Council's security personnel fell back under the assault. Some died. Others retreated deeper into the station. The Nocturnians did not stop to finish the wounded. They had a more valuable objective. The humans were still on the station, and the Council had placed a human child in a quarantine chamber on the upper levels. Keeper Zex received the emergency alert in the observation deck. The alarms were loud and urgent. He turned his colors to a defensive shade, preparing to flee deeper into the station. Ambassador Torvin's geometric form flickered with agitation. A breach during their observation of the human child. The Council would demand explanations. Then Keeper Zex realized something that made his entire being freeze. The quarantine chamber was in lockdown mode. It had been designed by the Council as an absolute sanctuary. Nothing could penetrate its walls. Nothing could harm the child inside. They were completely safe, unless the attackers sealed the chamber's exterior doors from the outside. The Nocturnian team accessed the control panel in the corridor. Their commander tore apart the electronic locks with weapons fire. Within seconds, the manual overrides engaged. The quarantine chamber's exterior entrance sealed. The chamber went into complete isolation. The child inside would be trapped, unable to call for help. Unable to receive assistance. Commander Kelts stared at the sealed chamber. Inside, the human child sat on his bunk, reading his book. The being had looked up at the noise. The child's eyes showed surprise but not panic. Kelts found this strange. The creature should have been screaming. It should have been thrashing against the walls. Instead, it simply watched. "The child is secure," one of the Nocturnian soldiers reported. "We have contained him. The Council will negotiate rather than risk his life." Kelts nodded. It was a good strategy. The humans valued their young. The Council had shown this clearly by bringing the child to the station. Now the child was leverage. Raw, powerful leverage. The Council would do anything to get the human back alive. The Nocturnian commander moved to stand before the quarantine chamber door. He pressed his clawed hand against the transparent panel. Inside, Luke Morrison stared back at him. The child showed no fear. The child showed no weakness. The child simply watched with eyes that seemed far older than his 9 years. Kelts made a decision. He would show the human child what true power looked like. He would demonstrate the vast distance between human weakness and Nocturnian strength. He would break this child's spirit before the Council tried to negotiate his release. A broken child would be a more effective hostage. A terrified child would make the Council more desperate, but as he stared into Luke Morrison's eyes, the Nocturnian commander felt something move through his ancient instincts. Something was wrong. The child was not behaving as prey should behave. The child was not terrified. The child was not broken. The child looked at him with a calm that was absolutely unnatural for a 9-year-old human facing a predator. "Secure this position," Kelts ordered his soldiers. Maintain guard over the chamber. The child is not to leave. If the council tries to breach this section, you have orders to execute the prisoner. The Nocturnian soldiers stationed themselves around the quarantine chamber. They had overwhelming firepower. They had overwhelming strength. They were warriors of the highest caliber. A single human child was beneath their concern. In the command center, the council convened an emergency session. The council speaker Carandos demanded a report. The security chief explained the situation with clinical precision. A Nocturnian assault team had breached the station. They had taken control of 3 sections. They had isolated the human delegation in the lower levels. And they had seized the human child. The Nocturnians were now demanding safe passage off the station in exchange for the child's life. The council erupted into chaos. The Narratians called for immediate military response. The Zalexians wanted to allow the Nocturnians to take the child and leave, arguing it was not worth the cost of defending. The council speaker called for silence. Decisions needed to be made quickly. What no one in the command center considered was what the human child was doing in his sealed chamber. Luke Morrison stood up from his bunk and began a careful examination of his prison. His father had taught him this. Examine the problem. Understand the available resources. Develop a solution. His small hands moved across the walls, searching for the emergency panels. His eyes studied the environmental controls. His mind worked through the possible escape routes. The Nocturnians had sealed the chamber, but they had not understood human flexibility. They had not appreciated human desperation. They had not comprehended that a species which survived on a harsh and brutal world like Earth did not simply surrender to captivity. Luke Morrison was alone. The Nocturnians had superior weapons and strength. The council was negotiating for his release. Nobody expected him to act, and that was exactly when he began to move. That was exactly when the human child stopped being a hostage and started being something far more dangerous. That was exactly when the observers in the station began to understand that they had made a terrible mistake in assessing human weakness. In the observation deck, Keeper Zex watched the security footage of the quarantine chamber. He watched the human child move with purpose. He watched the being begin to systematically dismantle his prison. He watched a child confront an impossible situation and respond not with panic but with action. And Keeper Zex understood that everything the council believed about humanity was about to change. Luke Morrison worked in silence. The power had been cut to the chamber. The lights had died. The environmental systems had stopped functioning. The communications were dead. The Nocturnians had intended this isolation to break his will. They had expected the child to sit in darkness and fear. They did not understand the human species. Luke had studied the chamber carefully. He had paid attention to every detail. His father had taught him that knowledge was survival. Jack Morrison had shown his son how systems worked. Jack had explained that if you understood how something was built, you could understand how to make it work again. The quarantine chamber was not mystery to Luke. It was a puzzle waiting to be solved. His fingers found the emergency panel beneath the wall covering. The panel was mechanical, not electronic. The designers had built redundancies into the system. If the power failed, there had to be a way for the child to access basic life support. Luke pried the panel open. His small hands moved through the mechanical levers. He understood what each one controlled. He understood the logic of the system. The oxygen valve moved. Air began to flow. It was not much. It was not the full system, but it was enough to keep him alive in this sealed chamber. The temperature controls were next. Luke worked through the levers with careful precision. The chamber began to warm. He was still not comfortable, but he was no longer in immediate danger. His hands were shaking. His heart was beating fast. Fear was a real thing. pressing against his chest. But fear was not the same as surrender. Fear was not the same as helplessness. Fear was just a feeling. And feelings could be controlled. Luke sat on the bunk and thought about what came next. The Nocturnians would try to force the door. They would try to take him. They were stronger. They were faster. They were warriors evolved for violence. He was a 9-year-old human child from a planet called Earth. By every measure of logic, he should have given up. But Luke Morrison was a human. His species had survived ice ages. They had crossed oceans in primitive boats. They had climbed mountains that should have killed them. They had built civilizations. They had created art and music and literature. They had done all of this on a world where nature was constantly trying to kill them. Earth was a death world. And humans had not just survived it. They had thrived. Luke understood this on a level that was not quite conscious. It was written into his genes. It was part of the legacy his ancestors had passed down through thousands of generations. The instruction was simple: refuse to break. Refuse to surrender. Find another way. He began to gather his resources. The reading light was heavier than it looked. It was made of thick metal. It could be a weapon. The first aid kit contained sharp instruments. The bunk could be disassembled. The water containers could be used for weight. The chair could be positioned to create obstacles. His book could be used to create shadow and confusion in the darkness. The isolation was not a prison. It was a preparation ground. Luke arranged the furniture carefully. He created a maze in the chamber. He positioned heavy objects where they would slow down anyone trying to force their way inside. He gathered his makeshift weapons. He studied the chamber's layout in the darkness until he could move through it without sight. He practiced holding his breath. He exercised to keep his heart rate controlled. The hours passed. Time moved strangely in the sealed chamber. Luke did not know if it had been 3 hours or 6 hours since the power cut. He did not know if the council was negotiating. He did not know if rescue was coming. All he knew was that he would not be taken without a fight. His mind moved to his mother. Claire Morrison loved her son with a ferocity that had no equal. She had held him before he boarded the transport. She had cried tears that burned against his neck. She had told him to survive. She had told him to come home. Luke felt her presence in the sealed chamber. He felt her strength moving through his small body. His mind moved to his father. Jack Morrison believed in preparation. Jack believed in knowledge. Jack believed that understanding your environment meant you could control your outcome. Luke had inherited these beliefs. He had inherited the refusal to accept defeat. He had inherited the human capacity to find solutions when no solution seemed possible. The chamber began to go cold again. The emergency system was limited. Luke knew he could not maintain the life support for extended periods. But he did not need extended periods. He needed the Nocturnians to open the door. He needed them to come inside. He needed them to discover that a small human child was far more dangerous than they had anticipated. Luke sat in the darkness and waited. He breathed slowly. He kept his heart rate controlled. He thought about his movements. He thought about speed and surprise and the power of absolute desperation. The Nocturnians would expect a child to be broken. The Nocturnians would expect a human to be helpless. The Nocturnians would expect surrender. They would find none of these things. The power to the chamber flickered. Something had changed in the station. The Nocturnians were doing something. Luke heard the sound of the locks being forced. The door mechanism began to grind. This was the moment. This was when everything would change. This was when a child who had been labeled helpless would stand against predators and refuse to break. Luke stood up in the darkness. His small frame was shaking. His 9-year-old heart was hammering in his chest. His hands gripped the reading light. His mind was absolutely clear. There was no room for fear now. There was only room for action. The external door began to open. The Nocturnians were coming. They were coming to take him. They were coming to use him as leverage against the Council. They were coming to demonstrate the helplessness of humanity, and they were about to discover something that no amount of evolutionary advantage could overcome. They were about to meet the true nature of the human species. They were about to understand that soft did not mean weak, that fragile did not mean breakable, that a child from a death world had been forged in conditions that created an unbreakable will. Luke Morrison stepped forward to meet his enemy, and for the first time since the chamber sealed, he was not afraid. He was ready. The chamber door exploded inward. Commander Keltz entered first, his massive frame filling the doorway. His eyes burned with bioluminescent hunger. Behind him came two more Nocturnian soldiers, their weapons ready, their claws extended. They had come to recapture a helpless child. They had come to secure their hostage. They did not come prepared for what happened next. Luke threw the reading light at the ceiling fixture. The impact was perfect. Sparks exploded across the chamber. The already failing lights died completely. Darkness claimed everything. The Nocturnians had thermal vision, but they had not come prepared for a human operating in absolute blackness in a space they did not know. Luke moved. His small body flowed through the obstacles he had created. He knew every position. He knew every path. He moved like he was part of the darkness itself. He threw the chair directly into Commander Keltz's path. The Nocturnian collided with the furniture. He was too large to move with the precision that darkness required. "The child is moving," one of the soldiers reported. "I have thermal contact." Luke had anticipated this. He rolled against the wall where the damaged environmental system had failed to restore proper temperature. The cold air from the broken system masked his thermal signature. His small body pressed against the ice-cold metal panels. The Nocturnian's thermal imaging showed only a faint human shape, impossible to target with precision. "He is there," another soldier said, pointing. Against the east wall. Luke was already gone. He had moved to the opposite side of the chamber. His hands gripped the first aid kit. He threw it against the wall. It struck with a sound that echoed through the sealed space. The Nocturnians fired their weapons. Plasma seared through the air. The shots struck nothing. Luke was not where the sound had come from. The human child was using the chamber itself as a weapon, turning architecture and sound and darkness into combat tactics that made no sense to predators evolved for brutal, direct violence. Commander Keltz roared. It was a sound that had driven countless species to surrender. It was the sound of an apex predator unleashing its rage. The Nocturnian commander activated his suit's illumination systems. Light flooded the chamber. Now the field was even. Now the Nocturnians could see. What they saw made them pause. Luke Morrison stood in the center of the chamber, surrounded by obstacles, his small chest heaving with exertion and adrenaline. His 9-year-old frame was soaked with sweat. His eyes were wide. His hands were shaking. And his expression was pure defiance. "I will not go with you," Luke said. His voice was small but steady. It was the voice of a child who had moved beyond fear into the realm of absolute determination. "I will not let you hurt anyone. I will not surrender." Commander Keltz moved toward the child. He was slow and careful, expecting some new trick. The human child could not hurt him. The human child could not hurt any of them. And yet something in his warrior's instinct told him to be cautious. Something in his 10,000 years of evolutionary development recognized that this small creature was far more dangerous than its size suggested. Luke ran. He threw himself at the Nocturnian commander with no strategy except pure defiance. His small fists struck the predator's armored chest. They bounced off harmlessly, It was completely ineffective. It was absolutely pointless. And it was the most terrifying thing Commander Keltz had ever witnessed because it demonstrated something that no amount of power could overcome. A being that refused to accept defeat. The other Nocturnian soldiers moved to intercept. Luke scrambled up the chamber walls, using the furniture as a ladder. He reached the maintenance panel in the ceiling. His thin body squeezed through the opening. Behind him, the Nocturnians fired their weapons again. The shots tore through the chamber. They tore through the walls. They tore through the life support systems, but they did not hit the human child. Luke pulled himself into the ventilation system. It was cramped. His small body fit easily. The Nocturnians could not follow. They were too large, too heavy, too dependent on their physical power. The human child had turned his size from a weakness into an advantage. "Seal the chamber," Commander Keltz ordered. His thermal imaging showed the child moving through the sealing ductwork. The human was escaping. The human was escaping despite everything. Despite the overwhelming power of the Nocturnian soldiers. Despite the superior weapons. Despite the impossible odds. The human child was moving through the ceiling toward the sealed section's outer compartment. Luke crawled through the ducts with desperate speed. His lungs burned. His muscles screamed. His hands bled from the sharp metal edges. But he did not stop. He could not stop. To stop was to surrender. To stop was to fail. To stop was to accept the role of victim. He found the emergency access to the next chamber. His fingers worked the manual override. The duct panel fell open. Luke dropped down into a new room. This one was part of the station's security checkpoint. There were weapons here. There were communications equipment. There was a path to the main security station. The Nocturnians burst through the sealed door behind him. They had blown through the barrier. They were coming. They were hunting. They were the apex predators pursuing prey that refused to acknowledge its own helplessness. Luke reached the communication panel. His small fingers flew across the buttons. He transmitted a simple message on all frequencies. His location, the number of attackers, the status of the hostage situation. He was a 9-year-old human child sending out a distress signal that told the entire council exactly where the Nocturnian assault team had positioned themselves. Captain Sarah Lynn received the signal in the security command center. The transmission was clear, precise. The location data was perfect. The signal told her that the human child was not only alive, but actively fighting. Sarah Lynn moved with the speed of a true warrior. She assembled a response team. She armed them with the most powerful weapons in the station's arsenal. She led them personally toward the quarantine chamber. The Nocturnian soldiers heard the reinforcements coming. They heard the sounds of military deployment. They heard the footsteps of soldiers moving through the corridors. The assault had failed. Their hostage had escaped. Their strategic advantage had dissolved. And the cause was a 9-year-old human child who had refused to accept helplessness. Commander Keltz found Luke backed against the far wall of the security checkpoint. The child's breath came in ragged gasps. His body was battered. His clothes were torn. His hands were bleeding. His small frame was shaking with exhaustion, and his eyes still burned with defiance. The mod with defiance. Nocturnian commander could have taken him. He could have crushed the child with a single motion. He could have ended this. But something in those eyes made him stop. Something in the absolute refusal of this small human to surrender made the ancient warrior understand that taking this child by force would not be victory. It would be something else. Something the Nocturnians did not have words for. Something that their species had never encountered. The sounds of security forces filled the corridor. They were seconds away. Commander Keltz made his decision. He retreated. He called his soldiers. He moved toward the auxiliary bay where their vessel waited. The assault had failed. The hostage had been lost. The human child had won. As the Nocturnian assault team fled the station, Captain Sarah Lynn reached the security checkpoint. She found the human child still standing there, still breathing hard, still refusing to collapse. She wrapped him in her arms and felt him begin to shake with delayed reaction. The fear was finally breaking through. The desperation was finally fading. And the reality of what had just happened was beginning to sink in. A perturbed 9-year-old human child had held an entire Nocturnian assault team in check. A 9-year-old human child had refused to be taken hostage. A 9-year-old human child had fought against hopeless odds and refused to surrender. And by doing so, he had changed the way an entire galactic civilization understood the meaning of strength. The medical droid completed its examination in 17 minutes. The readings confirmed what the physical inspection had already shown. Bruises across the child's small body, cuts on his hands and feet, elevated stress hormones still flooding through his system, minor dehydration, but no broken bones, no internal bleeding, no permanent damage. The human child would survive. Claire Morrison arrived at the medical bay 3 hours later. The transport had carried her across the vast distance between Kepler 7 colony and the Galactic Council station in record time. She did not wait for the medical droid to finish its final scans. She did not listen to the security briefing. She simply walked into the medical chamber and wrapped her arms around her son. She held him for 43 minutes without speaking. Luke cried. His small body shook with the release of everything he had held back. The fear, the pain, the desperation, the absolute terror of being alone in that chamber. All of it poured out while his mother held him and did not let go. Jack Morrison arrived 2 hours after his wife. He did not embrace his son immediately. Instead, he stood in the doorway and stared at his child. Then he walked to the bunk and sat beside his son. He took Luke's bleeding hands in his own. He looked at his son's eyes and said only 3 words. "You did well." Luke nodded and began crying again. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session at 22:14 station time. The council chamber was full. Every member species had sent representatives. The debate was fierce. The Zelexians called for immediate military action against the Nocturnians. The Nararians requested analysis of the security breach. The council speaker Carandos demanded a full report on how a 9-year-old human child had held back a Nocturnian assault team. Ambassador Torvin reviewed the security footage again and again. His geometric form flickered with something that Keeper Zex recognized as profound disturbance. The crystalline being was struggling to process what the data showed. The human child had not fought with superior strength. He had not fought with advanced weapons. He had not fought with superior training. He had fought with something far more basic. He had fought with the absolute refusal to accept defeat. The human young did not merely resist, Torvin said slowly, his voice like ice. The human young created a combat strategy. The human young used environment. The human young used darkness and sound and thermal masking. The human young outhawed a predatory species that has spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of violence. Keeper Zex's colors shifted to white. This was pure revelation. We have been assessing this species incorrectly. We have been assessing this species catastrophically incorrectly, another council member said. This was the Zelexian representative, a being evolved for violence and warfare. Humans do not fight with the tools of strength. They fight with the tools of intelligence. They adapt. They refuse to accept the limitations we assign to them. The council speaker Carandos raised his appendage for silence. He was 3,000 years old. He had observed countless species rise and fall. He had watched empires collapse. He had guided the Galactic Alliance through wars and peace, and he understood something that the others were only beginning to grasp. "We sent an observation team to assess human weakness," Carando said. "We discovered human strength. Not the strength of physical power, but something far more dangerous. The strength of absolute will." The Nocturnian Command received a message from their assault team. The mission had failed. The human child had escaped. The strategic advantage had been lost. The assault had been abandoned. And more importantly, the message that came back from Commander Keltz was shocking. The commander recommended that the Nocturnian Empire mark humanity as a species not to be provoked, a species not to be underestimated, a species that could only be fought through negotiation and respect, not through predatory violence. A Nocturnian commander had never made such a recommendation before. On the observation deck, Keeper Zex showed Ambassador Torvin a recording. It was the moment just before the Nocturnian soldiers fled the station. It was Luke Morrison, standing against the wall, blood on his hands, his small body bruised and battered, his eyes still burning with defiance. And the recording showed Commander Keltz looking at the child for a full 10 seconds before choosing to retreat. An apex predator had chosen not to fight a 9-year-old human. Why? Torvin demanded. Why would the Nocturnian commander choose to flee? He had overwhelming advantage. Keeper Zex played the footage again. Look at the child's eyes. Look at what the predator was seeing. It was not prey. It was something that refused to accept the role of victim. It was a being that would continue fighting even unto death. It was something that the Nocturnian species recognized as fundamentally more dangerous than its size suggested. Ambassador Torvin's geometric form became still, completely still. For the first time since the assault began, the crystalline being understood something beyond simple logic and data. He understood something emotional, something that the humans carried inside them, something called determination. The Galactic Council voted at 6:34 station time. The vote was unanimous. Earth would be granted full membership in the United Galactic Alliance. Earth would be provided with access to advanced technology, diplomatic representation, and security guarantees. Not because humans were strong, not because humans were advanced, but because humans possessed something that every species in the galaxy understood. The refusal to break. Jack and Claire Morrison stood with their son on the observation platform. Luke stared out at the stars. His hands were wrapped in medical bandages. His body ached. His mind was still processing what had happened. "What are you thinking?" his father asked. "I am thinking that the council was wrong about us," Luke said slowly. "They thought we were helpless. They thought we were weak. And now they know better," his mother said, holding his shoulder. "Now they understand that soft does not mean weak," Luke agreed. "Now they understand that breaking is not the same as failing." Jack Morrison put his hand on his son's shoulder. "You showed them something that they had never seen before. You showed them what it means to be human. You showed them that we do not surrender." In the council chamber, the debate continued. The Zelexians discussed military cooperation agreements. The Naiarians requested mathematical collaboration. The council speaker Carendos oversaw it all with the satisfaction of one who had witnessed an empire move from contempt to respect. Keeper Zex transmitted a private message to all council members. It was a recording. A child, a sealed chamber. A 9-year-old human being who had stood against impossible odds and refused to break. The message was simple. The humans were not helpless. The humans had never been helpless. The humans had simply been misunderstood. They were what the Nocturnians now called them. The honey badgers, small, seemingly fragile, absolutely lethal when cornered. Creatures that would fight with everything they possessed. Creatures that would never accept surrender. And every fighter in the Galactic Alliance learned to respect what the honey badger represented. They learned that physical strength was not the measure of true power. They learned that a species that could produce a 9-year-old child willing to stand alone against predators was a species that could never be dominated. Luke Morrison returned to Kepler 7 colony. He returned to his school. He returned to his normal life. But he carried with him the knowledge that he had changed his entire species' position in the galactic hierarchy. He carried with him the understanding that refusal to surrender could accomplish what physical strength could not. And on every world where humans lived, the story spread. The story of a child who had been called helpless. The story of a child who had shown the galaxy what human courage truly meant. The story of the honey badger who would face the darkness and refuse to break.